climate change fact or fiction? And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at 4 questions. Question number 1 is climate changing? Question number 2, are humans responsible? Question number 3, why does it even matter? And question number 4, what can you do about it? So I want to ask you a second question. So don't put poll EV to bed yet. We're going to go back to it a few times, and here we are right now. Which question do you feel least able to answer? Do you feel least confident in your answer to is climate changing? Or are humans responsible? Or why does it even matter? Or what you can do about it? Or all of these plus a few more questions? And don't worry, we'll have time for Q&A at the end. Or none, you're ready to give the webinar yourself. And I see that I'm delighted there's 2 people who are ready to give the webinar themselves, which is fantastic. Okay, so it looks like D is a winner, but there's a fair amount of votes for B, E, and F. Anyone else? Oh, there's another vote. Okay, good. All right. And again, how you respond is always at the top here, pollev.com. We have a few more people in the waiting room. Hello, latecomers. You are welcome. We're just getting started, so don't worry, you haven't missed much. I'm going to be asking you interactive questions as we go along, and you can answer those questions at pollev.com/myname, which is Catherine. All right, so let's get started now on our 3 questions. Oh, good, and I see they put that link in the Zoom chat too. So the 3 questions, or the 4 questions we're looking at today are, is climate changing? Are humans responsible? Why does it matter? And what can you do about it? Question number 1, is climate changing? Well, every time we see something in the news, it's a heat wave. And people say, a heat wave, it must be global warming. And then they say, oh, but it just snowed in Colorado. And of course, this just happened last week. Where is global warming now? We don't understand the difference between weather and climate. But here's the difference. Weather is what happens in a certain place on a certain day or week or even year. Weather's like a tree, a single tree. But climate is like the forest, all the trees. It's all the weather on all the days over at least 20 to 30 years. So if we're talking about a changing climate, we can't just say, oh, it was hot outside or it was cold outside. We have to look at how conditions have been changing over at least 20 to 30 years. That's the difference between weather and climate. But here's the problem. Our brains aren't wired, I should say, to remember climate. Our brains are wired to remember weather, right? To remember climate, our brains would have to be able to add up temperature and rainfall and humidity and other things every single day of the year for at least 20 to 30 years and then fit a trend line to it to see if it's going up or down. And I don't know about you, but my brain doesn't do that. So our brains aren't really built to understand climate. They're built to remember weather. And that's one of the biggest problems we have. So here's a different way to look at it. Here's what our normal weather looks like. And this is just a wiggly line I drew, but you can imagine it's like you have cold and you have hot, or you have wet and you have dry. And of course, if you live in Texas, it looks more like this. This is our weather, but this is our climate. Climate is the long-term average of weather over 20 to 30 years. That's the black line in the middle. And climate is also the range of expected weather. So the average highs, the average lows, the 500-year flood event, the average number of heat waves you have, all of that is climate. Here in Texas, we get more crazy weather than any other state in the country. This is a map showing the number of weather and climate disasters that have caused at least $1 billion of damage since 1980. And one state is number 1, and that state is Texas. Why is that? It's because we get it all. When it comes to crazy weather, we get floods, right? We get hurricanes, of course. We get water shortages and droughts. We get record-breaking wildfires, even here in Texas. We haven't had bad ones for a few years now, but back in 2011, 2012, we had some very bad wildfires here in Texas. And of course, we get rain and flood. So you live in Texas, at least I think most of you do. Tell me, what's the most memorable extreme weather event that you've experienced in Texas? Now, here's what you have to do. You have to answer here with a word. And if you're going to use more than one word, listen carefully, you have to join that word with a dot or a dash. So if you're going to say, for example, rainstorm, you can either say rainstorm, all one word, or you have to say rain dot storm. Okay, haboob, yes, I was here. Well, actually, I wasn't here for the haboob. I left my car with the window open at the airport during the haboob. It was never the same since. If you've just joined us, you can also respond to this poll at pollev.com/Catherine. The address is right at the top of the screen. All right, so it looks like we had a few people who are here for the haboob. Okay, tornado, Hurricane Ike, yes, dust storm, Yep, this looks typical Lubbock, doesn't it? Hurricane Katrina, Another tornado, yes. Seven inches of rain in one day in Lubbock. Yeah, you figured out how to use that dash, yes. All right, so we all have our weather story, and it wasn't too hard to think of it, was it? But we aren't built to think about climate. So here in Lubbock, I don't know if you remember, but back in 2012, we actually won for the wildest or toughest weather city in America. And ironically, the same year, we also won a different competition. I don't know if you remember, we won a competition for the most boring city in America. And I just don't understand that, because what do you talk about with people? You talk about the weather, right? So I don't know how that could be. But we do have crazy weather here. So when we're asking if climate is changing, we have to say not is it hot or cold outside or wet or dry. We have to say, are our long-term average conditions changing? And are the average weather extremes changing? Are they becoming more frequent or stronger or more intense or longer? Over what? Over climate timescales, so at least 20 to 30 years. And as you'll see, the answer to these questions for us is yes. Specifically here in Texas, I've looked at all of the weather stations in Texas myself, and they clearly show us that every single season in Texas has been getting warmer since the 1950s, every single one. Now, of course, sometimes we have a cooler spring or a warmer summer, but every season has been getting warmer long term, and winter has been warming the fastest. Does that mean that we don't get snow? No, we still get the occasional snow. Nobody said they were here for the blizzard a few years ago, but I was here for the blizzard a few years ago, so I remember that very vividly. But on average, over 20 to 30 years, winter is warming the fastest. And so what we see is that our average pattern of hot and cold is starting to tilt upwards. So the black line again here is climate, and the wiggly line is weather. Can you still get cold weather as it's warming? Yes, you can. But long term, it's ticking steadily up. Why do we care about a changing climate, a changing average condition? It's because almost every aspect of our planning is built on a stable climate. Where and how we grow our food, what types of plants and animals we have living in a certain place, how much water we need, how much electricity we need, how much heating and cooling we need. All of that is built on the assumption that when we look at what it's been in the past, that will tell us what we need for the future. That's how our whole civilization is built. But today that's changing. It's not just changing here in Texas, it's changing across the US and around the world. As you can see, winter temperatures are changing fastest. And people say, well, what's going on there in the Southeast? There's something weird happening there. Well, part of what's happening there is they have so much moisture that as it gets warmer, it's actually making it much more humid. So they're not seeing a big change in temperature, they're seeing a big change in humidity there, which of course feels warmer. What else is happening in Texas? Well, we have not seen big changes in our average annual rainfall. Now, some years are wetter, some years are drier, but our average annual rainfall hasn't changed. But what's happening is that wiggly line is getting stretched. In other words, our extremes are becoming more extreme. We're seeing more heavy precipitation and we're seeing more dry periods in between. So not only do we see that our average is changing, but pay attention here and don't blink, but we see that our extremes are changing. You see that? The average is changing and the extremes are also changing. So why else do we care about a changing climate? Because it takes so many of the risks we already face today and it makes them worse. Like what? Well, here we are in Texas again with the largest number of billion-dollar weather and climate disasters naturally, because we get every type of thing you can imagine here naturally. But what climate change is doing is, it's like it's loading the dice against us. So wherever you live, we already have a chance of rolling a double six. What's a double six? An extreme weather event. Anywhere you live in the world, no matter where you live, you always have a chance of some type of extreme weather event happening naturally. If you live in Texas, you already have, so to speak, 3 sixes on your dice, because we already have a greater than average chance naturally in Texas of rolling a double six. But as the planet warms, as climate changes, it's like it's sneaking in decade by decade, and it's taking one of those numbers and then another of those numbers and turning them into sixes too, and then eventually turning one or two numbers into a 7. So all of a sudden we're rolling more and more sixes, and we're saying, how could this happen? How could Houston experience 3 500-year flood events in 3 years? You're only supposed to have on average one every 500 years. It's because the dice are getting loaded against us. What is happening here in Texas? Well, specifically, our heavy rainfall is becoming more intense and more frequent because warmer air holds more water vapor. So when a storm comes along, there's more water vapor up there now compared to 50 or 100 years ago for that storm to sweep up and dump on us. And we're seeing these changes all across the country. In fact, I saw someone said they were from Massachusetts in the chat. In the Northeast, they are seeing even greater increases in heavy precipitation than we are seeing here in Texas. They've seen the biggest increases since the 1950s in the Northeast and the Midwest. But we are seeing them too, especially in the eastern part of our state. So heavy precipitation is increasing. And it's not only normal storms, it's hurricanes too. We don't see that hurricanes are getting more frequent. Some years we have a lot of them. We've already had 51 named storms this year, but other years we just have, a handful of named storms. But they are definitely being affected in multiple ways. Like what? Well, first of all, they're really big storms, and so with all that extra water vapor in the atmosphere in a warmer world, they can sweep it all up and dump it on us. And we're seeing a lot more rainfall now from any given hurricane than we would have 50 or 100 years ago. For example, it's estimated that for Hurricane Harvey, which as you know dumped up to 50 inches of rain in some parts of the greater Houston area, for Hurricane Harvey, it's estimated that 40% of the rain that fell during Hurricane Harvey would not have happened if the same hurricane had happened 100 years ago, which it easily could have, right? But 40% of that rain would not have come with it. What else is happening? Well, hurricanes are fed by warm ocean waters. The oceans are warming, so the storms are intensifying faster. So they're going from a tropical storm to a category 1, 2, 3, or 4 faster. And we saw this with Hurricane Laura just a few weeks ago. That hurricane went from a tropical storm to category 4 faster than predicted. And that is happening increasingly again and again. More of them are stronger, same number of storms, but more are stronger. They're slowing down, which is bad news because it means they can sit over us and dump rain for longer. And they're getting bigger. And of course, sea level's rising too. So when the storm surge sweeps ashore, the sea level's already higher. So more and more area is getting flooded. None of that is good news. We also see that heat waves have become more frequent and cold waves less frequent, although we still do get them. And we see this not just here in Texas, we see this around the world. We just had a very hot summer here in Texas. In Central Texas, just last week, it was over 104 degrees And then, of course, it shot down to like 50 degrees in 24 hours. But we had a pretty hot summer, and that happens all over the world. Hundreds of high temperature records are broken every summer, and the dice are getting loaded against us. So for example, in Europe, they have had 500-year summers in terms of the heat in just 15 years. That's one 500-year summer every 3 years. And again, you shouldn't be having one every 3 years. You should be having on average one every 500 years. So that's how the dice are getting loaded against us. What about wildfires? I don't know about you, but my news feed has been full of apocalyptic looking orange skies in California and Oregon, with devastating stories and heartbreaking stories of people who have been affected. Their homes have been lost. They themselves have lost family members. Everybody from babies to grandparents have been lost in the fires. Wildfires are devastating. Now, just to be clear, in the lower 48 US states, just about, not every, but just about every wildfire is typically started by people. They're started by the infamous gender reveal fireworks from the other week. They're started by people dumping a load of burning trash into the dry brush. That happened last year. Occasionally, they're started by lightning strikes, as they were 2 or 3 weeks ago. And up in Canada and Alaska, most wildfires there are started by lightning strikes. But in the lower 48 states, most of them are started by people. So you might say, well, people aren't starting more fires because of climate change. No, of course not. But once those fires start, they are burning greater and greater area. Why? Because the vegetation is so dry, because we're getting much hotter and drier out west. So when the fire starts, it's like it has all of this kindling and tinder to burn. I don't know if you've ever lit a fire, but if you have, and I've lit quite a few fires in my life, if you light a fire with green, wet wood, what happens? The fire doesn't catch, it kind of smokes, it eventually goes out, you have unburned wood sitting there. But if you start a fire with dry wood and dry leaves, it catches right away and the whole thing is just consumed. That's the difference between starting a wildfire under regular conditions versus starting a wildfire under climate change conditions. And we are seeing this in the headlines. So back in 2017, 3 years ago, almost 3 years ago in December, the Thomas Fire became the largest wildfire on record in California 3 years ago. That record was broken 8 months later by the Ranch Fire in August 2018. That record for area burned was smashed by the Camp Fire in November 2018. And guess what headline I just saw last week? Now it was broken again. In fact, this is just from yesterday. The wildfire in Northern California is now the largest on record again. It isn't only in California and Oregon. If you think back to January 2020, which probably seems like about 10 years ago now, back in January 2020, the headlines were about what? They were about Australia, Australia's bushfires. And then the year before that, the headlines were about Alaska. It had its worst wildfire on season. A couple of years before that, there was the biggest natural disaster in Canadian history, the Fort McMurray wildfire. And the question is not, did climate change cause any of these events? The question is, did climate change make it worse? And the answer is yes. For example, with wildfires in the Western United States, without climate change, we would have wildfires, of course. That's a natural part of the ecosystem. Without climate change, wildfires would have burned about 11 million acres out west since the 1980s, total. That's the yellow area. What happened with climate change? With climate change, it burned double the area. So we have had twice the area burned by wildfires. And as you see, this figure only goes up to 2015. If we added it all the way up to 2020, that orange part would be a lot bigger because we've had some of our biggest fires since 2015. We know that climate change made Hurricane Harvey worse. We know that climate change is making heat waves worse. We know that whoever we are and wherever we live, we are being affected by a changing climate. And the Prime Minister of Dominica, I think, said it best. He said, to deny climate change is to deny a truth that we have just lived. So I want to ask you another question now. We're going back to poll everywhere. Ready? Who do you know, someone you know, who's been affected by area burned by wildfire or by crazy heat waves or by hurricanes or by flooding or drought the last few years? And remember, if you're going to say like brother-in-law, make sure you use a dash between the brother-in-law so it sticks together. So for me, my cousin and his family, their home was burned down in the Thomas wildfire. If you remember, that was the one that first broke the record for the largest wildfire in California. And not only that, but they had to evacuate again last summer from other wildfires, or not last summer, last November. So I'm sure many of you know people in Houston. There's many people who are being affected, and it's no longer people who live far away from us, it's people who we know who live nearby. All right, friend, niece, ranchers, colleague, yep. Friends, brother, sister. Climate change is here today. It's no longer a distant issue. All right. So now we're on to question number 2. And don't worry, the questions get shorter and shorter. And at the end, you get to ask me questions too. Okay, so question number 1 is climate changing? And the answer is, it is. Question number 2, how do we know it's humans? Well, we know that climate has changed in the past. How do we know that? Because we climate scientists study it. We are the ones who study past change. And so we know that in the past, climate has changed naturally. Due to what? Due to the sun, due to natural cycles, due to volcanoes, and more. So when we see climate changing, we don't automatically assume it's humans. We have to say, could it be one of these natural suspects? And here's what we find when we look at the data. Could it be the sun? Well, it turns out, no, it can't be the sun causing us to warm today, because since the 1970s, the sun's energy has been going down, not up. And if the sun's energy is going down, that means it has a cooling effect on us. But instead, we're getting warmer faster and faster. So the sun is actually helping us out a little tiny bit. It can't be the sun. Could it be natural cycles? Well, people often cite natural cycles, but they don't understand what they do. Natural cycles do not create heat out of nowhere like magic. Natural cycles move heat around the planet. They move it from east to west, north to south, ocean to atmosphere, and back again. So a natural cycle can make one part of the earth warmer, but it does so at the expense of another part of the earth that it makes cooler, because all it can do is move heat around. It can't create it. So if the entire planet were getting warmer, the whole atmosphere were getting warmer because of a natural cycle, the heat would have to be coming from somewhere. And there's only one place that much heat could come from, that's the ocean. So if the ocean is getting cooler and the atmosphere is getting warmer, it would be a natural cycle. But that's not what's happening at all. The ocean is getting warmer and the atmosphere is getting warmer. They're all getting warmer. We know that the Earth has had natural cycles before. And in fact, one of the most famous natural cycles that you might have heard of, a few people have heard of this one, but not everybody. One of the most famous natural cycles was the medieval warm period. During the medieval warm period, people moved to Greenland. It was never actually green, but it was warm enough that they could settle around the edges of the giant ice sheet. And so people say, well, but wasn't the whole planet warmer back then? No, actually it wasn't. Thanks to natural thermometers like tree rings and ice cores and pollen records, we can put together a picture of what the world looked like back during the medieval warm period. And you can see that the medieval warm period was actually only a warm period over the North Atlantic. Anywhere that was yellow or red or orange, that means warmer than average. But because it was a natural cycle, how did it make that one area warmer? By taking heat from somewhere else. And in this case, it took the heat from Siberia. Go over there to the right-hand side of the figure, and you can see in Siberia, it was not the medieval warm period, it was the medieval cold period. This is what a natural cycle looks like. What does it look like today? Today, it looks like this. Nothing like a natural cycle. The entire planet is warming. And then people say, oh, yeah, but aren't we just still getting warmer since the last ice age? I mean, we know there was an ice age. We know that it ended when this rodent went chasing an acorn and then broke off a piece of ice. No, just kidding. That's from the Ice Age movies. We know that there are ice ages, and we know that there's warm periods in between. And we know that those are because of the orbit of the sun around, or sorry, the orbit of the Earth around the sun. Over time, there are axes of rotation precesses like a top. You know, if you spin a child's top, it turns really quickly, but then it also turns very slowly. Our Earth's axis of rotation turns quickly every day, once a day, and it also turns very slowly over thousands of years. And that affects how sunlight falls on the Earth, and that's what drives the ice ages and the warm periods like we're in today. So people say, well, aren't we just getting warmer after the last ice age? Actually, no. Warming after the last ice age peaked about 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, and since then, we should be getting cooler, and instead, we're getting warmer and warmer. You see the pattern here? All of these natural factors should be cooling us, and instead, we're getting warmer. And we've got volcanoes too. What do volcanic eruptions do? I don't know if you've heard people tell you this, but I've heard this. People say, don't you know that one volcanic eruption produces more carbon pollution than the entire human population in 10 years or something like that? Unfortunately, that is absolutely wrong. Volcanic eruptions don't heat the Earth, they cool it. Why? Because they produce all kind of particles and dust that act like an umbrella around the Earth, reflecting the sun's energy back to space. So when we have a big volcanic eruption, we actually get a little bit cooler for anywhere for a couple of weeks to, if it's a really, really, really big eruption, like Mount Pinatubo back in 1992, we could get cooler for over a year. So no, it's not the sun, it's not natural cycles, it's not the ice age cycles, it's not volcanoes, it really is us. And if you want to know more about this, our global weirding series on YouTube that we do with KTTZ has an episode called This Is All Just Part of a Natural Cycle, right? And that episode explains more about all the natural factors that cause climate to change and how do we know that it really is us. So if you want more, go to Global Weirding. And actually, if somebody wouldn't mind typing it in the chat box, the link is globalweirdingseries.com. If you could just type that in the chat box and you click on it, it'll take you right there. What is happening to our planet? What's happening is that our planet has a natural blanket of heat-trapping gases. The sun shines down and the sun's energy goes through that blanket like a window. The Earth absorbs the heat energy from the sun and the energy from the sun and gives off heat energy, and that's trapped by this natural blanket that we have, and that keeps our planet at the perfect temperature for life. We'd be a frozen ball of ice if we didn't have this amazing natural blanket. So what's the problem? The problem is that we humans are digging up and burning coal and gas and oil that is producing more heat-trapping gases that are wrapping an extra blanket around the planet that it did not need. And just like you would if someone snuck into your room and put an extra blanket on your bed, and you would wake up in the middle of the night sweating, in the same way our planet has this extra blanket that we humans are wrapping around it that it never was designed to have and it does not need. And that is why our planet is running a fever. Now, just to check that you're still here and tracking with me, here's another question. How long have we known that burning fossil fuels produces heat-trapping gases that are wrapping an extra blanket around the planet? How long do you think we have known this? Have we known this since the 1850s, the 1900s, the 1950s, since a record-breaking hot summer in 1988, when NASA climate scientist Jim Hansen first testified to Congress and Time magazine had global warming on its cover? Or when Al Gore's movie was released? Was that the first time we knew about this? Thankfully, nobody answered E because that is not the correct answer. All right, it looks like we have 50% of people who probably watched our global weirding episode called How Long Have We Known About This? Because if you watched that global weirding episode, you would have heard of these people. You would have heard of Joseph Fourier in the 1820s, who actually discovered that we have this natural blanket on our planet that keeps us at the perfect temperature for life. You would have heard about John Tyndall and Eunice Foote in the 1850s, who figured out that humans were adding an extra blanket and that that extra blanket was causing the planet to warm. So 1850s is the right answer. And then Svante Arrhenius in the 1890s actually calculated how much the planet would warm, the more carbon dioxide we put in the atmosphere. And then Guy Callender in the 1930s, he was the first person to collect temperature data from all around the world and show that the planet really was warming. He did that almost 100 years ago. So yes, we know humans are responsible, and we've known this for a really long time. All right, now we're on to question number 3. So we talked about, is climate changing and how do we know it's humans? But question number 3 is really important, because question number 3 is the biggest problem most people have with this. Now, I know when you read the news, you hear a lot of people saying, oh, it's not real, climate isn't changing, it isn't humans. But when you survey people, and I'm going to show you this right here, when you survey people across the United States, we see that the biggest problem is that even if we agree with the science, which most of us do, over 60% of us do agree with the science, we don't think it matters. Here is the polling data. Ready? So this shows results by county. It's from the Yale Program on Climate Communication. You can look it up yourself, and you can see, you can click on each county. So you can even click on Lubbock County and see what it says. You can also choose to show this by congressional district instead, which is very interesting. And they also have maps for Canada too. So anywhere that's orange means that more than 50% of people said yes to the question at the top. And anywhere that's blue means that less than 50% of people said yes. And the darker orange, the more people said yes. The darker blue, the less people said yes. Okay, so here we have, do you think global warming is happening? Most people say yes, it's orange. There's just a few counties that are blue. Do you think global warming will harm plants and animals? Most people say yes. Do you think global warming will harm future generations? Again, most people say yes. So most people agree it's happening, it will harm plants and animals, and it will harm future generations. But then they said, do you think global warming will harm people in the United States? What do you see here? You see a lot more blue happening. And then they asked the real question, do you think global warming will harm you? Look at that. So even people who say, oh yes, it's real, it will harm plants and animals and future generations, none of us think it will harm us. Now you'll notice a couple of orange counties there, and you might wonder, why are those counties orange? Well, it turns out that when you break out this question, not by where you live, but by other demographics, it turns out that the most concerned people in the United States are Hispanic Catholics and Native Americans. So if you look at these counties, you can kind of see that that's where a lot of people who are very concerned about climate change live. Isn't that interesting? Why is that? It's because whenever we see a picture or a poster of a movie or a book or a TV show about climate change or global warming, what is on that? Typically, it's a polar bear, which is an animal that most of us have not seen in real life. Or if we see pictures of people, they're people who live far away from us, who look like they're kind of going about their daily life. Here they're walking along and they don't look happy about it, but you don't see the absolute devastation of lives lost, of homes lost, of livelihoods lost. We see it as a distant issue. But the reality is this, we care about climate change. Why? We care about it because it affects us. It affects our water, our food, our security, our homes, the economy, our health. It affects everything we already care about. So to care about climate change, we don't have to be a tree hugger. We don't have to be somebody from a certain part of the political spectrum. We just have to be somebody who cares about our family, who cares about our health, who wants a healthy economy, a safe place to live, clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, food to eat. And that's pretty much every single one of us. So the problem is not that people don't agree with the science or they need more education. If you've heard me talk, I talk a lot about those things in different types of talks. That's not the problem. The problem is that we don't understand that it matters to us. It affects us. The single best description of climate change I've heard comes from the US military. Yes, the military calls it a threat multiplier because it takes something that we're already worried about and it exacerbates it or it makes it worse. This happens in poor countries. Some colleagues of mine did a study last year where they showed that the gap between the richest and the poorest countries has already increased by as much as 25% since the 1960s due to climate change. But it doesn't just happen in places far away, it happens right here where we live. And how is it happening in Texas? It's happening by loading the weather dice against us, by giving us more heavy rain events, stronger hurricanes, more intense droughts, more frequent heat waves. Out in California and Oregon, by wildfires burning more area. Up in the Midwest, by terrible droughts like they had just a year ago last March. In the Northeast, by terrible heavy rainfall events and flooding. So here in Texas, we get floods, we get hurricanes, we get droughts, we get fires. And this is how climate change is affecting us in the places where we live by making these more intense and stronger and more damaging. If you follow headlines, you'll see some headlines that are starting to talk about this. Climate change will be bad for Dallas County. Climate change is going to bring North Texas longer droughts, heavy rains, 100-degree temperatures. There's a great website, and if somebody with quick fingers wouldn't mind typing this into the chat box, it's statesAtRisk.org/Texas. statesAtRisk.org/Texas. And it has over a dozen different ways that our state is going to be affected by climate change. And of course, they have a page for every state. So if you are from a different state, or if you know somebody from a different state and you want to share something with them, just go to statesAtRisk.org, leave off the Texas, and it will give you whatever state you want. But just to give you a couple of examples, these are just 3 examples I picked off their website this morning. We are seeing that our summers are getting hotter. In fact, San Antonio, Texas could feel like Gilbert, Arizona by the end of the century. And I don't know if you've ever been to Gilbert, Arizona, but it is the desert. On our coasts, we know that our flood events are increasing because sea level's rising. And in Port Isabel, for example, there has been 121 floods from 2005 to 14. And 86% of them were because of sea level rise. In other words, they would not have occurred 100 years ago. Here where I live in Lubbock, the mosquito season is almost twice as long as it used to be. I don't know about you, but we've had terrible mosquitoes in our backyard the last few weeks, and we're always having to go in or get bit. Well, the season is much longer than it used to be, and these things matter to us personally. So check out States at Risk for more information on how we're being personally affected by a changing climate. Not us, or sorry, not the polar bears, but us, not future generations, but here and now. So let me ask you this now. Don't forget to use a dot or a dash to join your words. When it comes to climate change, what are you personally most worried about? You personally. And if you personally are most worried about the polar bears, that's okay. You can be. Somebody needs to worry about the polar bears. There's a great organization called Polar Bears International that does. And when they asked me to come to the Arctic with them to see the polar bears and how they're being affected by climate change, I said, well, I would love to come, but to be honest, I study how people are being affected. And they said something that I've never forgotten. They said, we study the polar bears because after them, we are next. We are all vulnerable to the impacts of a changing climate. And the reasons why we care are different. But here in Texas, water is a big one, isn't it? We either have too much water or we have not enough water, right? We either have flooding or we have drought. And as somebody who looks at this globally, I'm very concerned about the potential impacts of climate change on, as this person said here, food security, civil unrest, and refugee crises. People and corporations not caring, wildlife, birds, things that can't adapt. Climate change affects all aspects of our lives here on this planet. And again, it isn't just about the polar bears, and it isn't just about the future. It is also about the here and about the now. So now we're on to our last question, and then you can ask me questions, okay? Our last question is this: what are we supposed to do about this? Because people always tell us, change your light bulbs. I've changed mine. Get a energy efficient car, fuel efficient car. Got that. I got solar panels. I plug my car into the wall to charge them. But we know instinctively that's not going to fix this global problem. The real answer to what you can do about it is actually in those maps I showed you. So remember the map that we ended on? It was, do you think it's going to affect you personally? Everybody said no, right? Almost everybody. There's a few orange counties in Florida, South Texas, New Mexico, California. But there's one more map I haven't showed you yet, and it's a darker blue. And this map asks people this: do you ever talk about it? Do you ever talk about it? No, nobody talks about it. And here's the connection. If we don't talk about it, why would we care? And if we don't care, why would we ever fix it? Just think about that. Now, people might say, well, I'm not a scientist, so how am I supposed to talk about it? What's the real problem we have? Remember what these maps showed us? The real problem is not that people don't understand the science. The real problem is nobody thinks it matters to us. So what's the most important thing to talk about? Not all that old science, though it's certainly fascinating. I'm a scientist, so I like to talk about it. But that isn't the most important thing. The most important thing to talk about is the person you know who has been affected by stronger hurricanes, by coastal flooding, by greater area burned by wildfires, by stronger droughts or heavy rainfall events. By talking about how it matters to us in the places where we live in ways that matter. Why don't we talk about it? Because we don't think it matters to us, and we don't think there's anything good that we can do to fix it. And when we do talk about it, climate changes and we get worried. So what do we do when we're worried? We share more scary data with people, and then what happens? It turns out that people reject it even more if they didn't already agree. And so inaction results. This is a vicious cycle. There's a neuroscientist called Tali Sharot who wrote a really great book called The Influential Mind. And in it, she explains how fear and anxiety causes us to withdraw, to freeze, and to give up rather than to take action. So when we talk about it, rather than saying, you need to stop doing this right away because if not, the entire world is going to end, people just put their hands over their ears and they don't want to listen. So rather than being caught in this vicious cycle, how do we break this cycle through talking about it in a constructive way? By talking about why and how climate change matters to us, not that Greenland's going to melt and the Arctic is going to melt and Siberia is on fire, but why and how it matters to us, and this is very important, all the positive things that we can do to fix it. So when climate changes and we get worried, you've seen this before, instead, break the cycle. Researcher Matthew Goldberg showed that having positive climate conversations with friends and family creates a positive feedback loop where when we share how it affects us and positive solutions, then people feel empowered and action results. It's a positive cycle rather than a vicious cycle. So how we talk about this matters a lot. And we've talked a lot already about how climate change affects us right here in the places where we live. But we haven't talked about positive solutions. So I want to end with just our last minute or two introducing the topic of positive solutions and giving you some more resources where you can find out more. Why does this work? As neuroscientist Tali Sharot says, the human brain is built to associate forward action with something positive, not avoiding harm. So when we reframe what we're saying so that the information we provide induces hope, not dread, people are willing to move forward physically as well as mentally. So that's why it's so important to talk about the good things. When we have a conversation, to bond over what we genuinely share, to connect it so we don't feel like it's a far off issue, and to inspire people with positive solutions so that they don't think that the only solution is to destroy the economy. What type of things can we bond over? The place where we live, our family, a shared faith, an activity we enjoy, experiences that we share. Might both be members of a Rotary Club or hunters or golfers or skiers. And then we can talk about positive solutions. The fact that here in Texas, we have almost 20% of our electricity from clean energy sources. We have the first carbon neutral airport in North America. It's in Dallas. We have an entire town that's gone green. The city of Dallas's operations are carbon neutral. We have the biggest army base in the US, Fort Hood. It's 100% powered by clean energy for the last 2 years. It's saving taxpayers $150 million in doing so, which is amazing. We have companies, some of the biggest companies in the world, that are transitioning to clean energy, Apple and Walmart. We have faith communities that are looking at clean energy solutions, from Catholics to evangelicals and many more in between. The Kentucky Coal Museum went with solar energy. United Airlines has been flying biofuel flights out of LA for years now, and nobody knows about it. That's pretty cool. Around the world, new clean energy is revolutionizing the lives of many people who didn't even have electricity to begin with. And there's all kinds of other solutions that aren't about energy, that are about coastal wetland protection, or more efficient use of the energy we have, or conservation agriculture like we're doing right here at Texas Tech, or composting, or food waste reduction. Did you know that if food waste were its own country, it would be number 3 in the world after China and the US in terms of its heat trapping gas emissions? So eating your leftovers actually helps. Project Drawdown, and if somebody with fast fingers could type this in the chat box, the website is drawdown.org. So not project, but just drawdown.org. Project Drawdown has over 100 incredibly positive solutions. So if you're looking for something to talk about, go to Project Drawdown, read one or more of their amazing short little articles, and share that information with somebody else. Because when you learn about what climate solutions look like, you can't help but get excited. And of course, we can talk about what we're doing individually. Do you go to the farmer's market? Do you eat less meat? Do you eat local? This is a picture of the solar panels on our house. We used to be able to recycle at the university, but we can't anymore. So that's a very sad thing. Doing individual actions makes a difference, but talk about them too. The single most important thing we can do, and this was my TED Talk, is talking about climate change. And if you're concerned about how do I do that, watch my TED Talk. If somebody, again, has fast fingers, if they can Google TED and hey-ho, you'll be able to find the link and put it in the chat box there. Watch my TED Talk for more examples on how to have positive, constructive conversations about climate change. But the way we begin those conversations is by connecting over who we are and what we have in common. So I have one last question for you, and then you can ask me questions. And my last question for you is this. When it comes to bonding over shared values, who are you? Why do you care about climate change? I care about climate change because I am what? Fill in the blank here. For me, it isn't just because I'm a scientist. I care about climate change because I am a mom, and I see that those are the 2 first things to go up there. I care about climate change because I'm a skier and I love having snow. I care about climate change because I'm a Christian. And I believe that as Christians, we are told that we have responsibility over every living thing on this planet. We are to care for those less fortunate than us. And that's exactly what climate change affects. I care about climate change because I'm a scientist and I study what's happening to our world. And I know that we're conducting an unprecedented experiment with the only home that we have. But all of these reasons have something to do with what? With our hearts, right? All of these reasons, whether we are something professionally, whether we are somebody in relationship to somebody else, all of these have to do with our hearts, who we are and what we care about. And so beginning these conversations from the heart is the single most effective thing we can do. And I want to end with one piece of good news, and it is this, that the best person to have a conversation about climate change is not me, it's you. According to social science, people who talk with their friends and their family are the #1 best messengers to have this conversation. Thank you so much for showing up so early on a Saturday morning. If you did not show up, don't worry, this has been recorded and you have obviously watched the whole thing by the time you got to this point. But now those of you who are live watching this in the morning are going to be able to ask me a few questions before we go.